Okay, all right, we're back. Part 2 of chapter 15. Okay, so I came back to this slide because we're starting the cultural aspect, the ideological, the intellectual, artistic component of the late 19th century and the turn of the 20th century. Now, I left you with the Stravinsky Rite of Spring, the dissonance, you might not have been able to hear it that well. I apologize for that, but go on YouTube and check it out, or just listen to it at some point, because it really, really captures this feeling of the fin de cycle, right? The end of the century, the end of the cycle, kind of questioning spirit of the certainty of Enlightenment thinking. And that's really what I wanted to get to, because what the end of the 19th century is the beginning of is, in terms of the overall movement in literature, in architecture, in art, in everything, in philosophy, is modernism. Modernism, and this is from Princeton. It's a very thorough definition, and I just want you to pause this for a second and read it real quick. Okay, just kind of take it in, read it. Okay, so a revolt, it says right here, right? A revolt against the conservative values of realism. Down here, rejected the lingering certainty of Enlightenment thinking, also that of the existence of a compassionate, all-powerful creator, right? Agnosticism, atheism, self-consciousness, right? But essentially a revolt, starting in the late 19th century, early 20th century, encompasses the activities and output of those who felt the traditional forms of art, architecture, literature, religious faith, social organization, and daily life were becoming outdated in the new economic, social, and political conditions of an emerging, fully industrialized world. There it is. Okay? Imperialism was changing everything. We get to that in chapter 16. Industrialism, the time period of the late 19th century is the second Industrial Revolution. It is the second Industrial Revolution, and we've talked about this a little bit. Remember how the industrial output, remember I said in class that before 1848, basically it was industrial output grew about 50%. Not that much, but as industrialization spreads between 1848 and 1873, it's 260%. Okay, that is right there. That's the second industrial revolution. Everything from transportation, steamships, guns, telegraph wire, communications. You name it. Like every single modern. That's what modernism comes from, right? Modern. Everything, every definition that we have of what is modern came to be essentially in the 19th century, and it's how people tried to react to this and figure it out, that modernism is. I love this quote. The broadest cultural sense, the assessment of the past as different to the modern age, the recognition that the world was becoming more complex and that the old final authorities, God, government, science, and reason, were subject to intense critical scrutiny. Okay, and we'll get to all that. Okay, so we did Stravinsky, right? I just love that. Anyway, I wanted to put this in because there's still that faith in science, the great faith in science that leads to so many discoveries in this time period, right? New ideas in science. The 50 years before World War I was a incredible time, and that just remember that modernism. Let me go back up here. Modernism doesn't really people don't realize that it's becoming, that they're doing something that becomes modernism until World War I really sets in. It's World War I that fully makes people realize oh my God, what have we done? Oh my God, what have we done to destroy this world? I mean, like, think about it. It's only been, 1789 was the French Revolution. We have to go to the French Revolution and the Enlightenment to kind of say that this is the next changing of the epoch. This is, as the guy in the Stravinsky movie says, the Belle Époque. This is the end, and this is the new beginning, right? But there's still that great faith in science, right? Science be praised, and I just had to put this in there as a little. What if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? Just the climate change, right? All that. All that good stuff, being as how we've had so much snow. So there's still great faith in science. Scientific progress is incredibly visible. Obviously, it's improving lives nearly every day in this time period. I mean, just think about gas lighting and electricity and Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Edison. I mean, just like, you name it, there's something being discovered. The conceptions of life in the universe are as revolutionary as when Newton basically said, look, there are universal laws like gravitation that govern everything, and they're indisputable, right? However, Newton gets turned on his head. Like, even Newton gets compromised, especially by Einstein. Okay, and it all starts. Not really starts, but the biggest blow is Darwin. Darwin, 1859. He did his research on the HMS Beagle in the 1830s. I think 1834 is when he set sail. Goes to the Galapagos, I believe. It's late, so I'm not really thinking clearly right now, but maybe the Galapagos, Canary Islands, I forget which one. But Origin of Species, published in 1859, Theory of Evolution through Natural Selection of Specimens whose chance mutations that improve chances of survival, right? And that's the key word there, chance mutations, right? You're a giraffe, you have a slightly longer neck than the other giraffe. Just by a chance mutation, you get an extra large vertebrae in there, right? You are able to eat the higher leaves on the tree, and therefore you live out when there's a blight of the trees that giraffes eat, right? The fittest, and we've talked about how it wasn't Darwin who said survival of the fittest, that it was Herbert Spencer, but the fittest are those best adapted, right? And the environment and their own traits determine the survival, right? So it's like the Marx quote when he says, men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please, right? The idea that environment is still a factor, obviously, but those mutations can benefit you. Then the second book, The Descent of Man. The second book, The Descent of Man, which was published in... Hold on, wait for it. That's one thing I didn't... Descent of Man, let's see. Published in 1871, okay, the year that Germany unified. This is where he has to take the step, after this entire brouhaha over evolution, comes to fruition. Basically, there's a big one of the biggest the 1860 Oxford debate on evolution, where it was just Bishop Samuel Wilberforce versus Thomas Henry Huxley, and Henry Huxley is defending Darwin, and it's there's some choice words that are there's some choice words that go back and forth. Let's see, it's the people in the room. This is at Cambridge. This is at Oxford. This is 1860, and Wilberforce is obviously a member of the clergy, and Henry Huxley is defending Darwin, and it's after The Origin of Species, and basically everybody can kind of infer from The Origin of Species that Darwin is talking about where does man come from? Man comes from, it was not created, right, by God out of Adam and Eve, right? I mean, it's like he's got legitimate proof that we descended, but descended from what, right? Evolved from what? And let's see. This is in a letter to one of the people who was in the room for this debate. A letter to his brother. Let's see. Referring to what Huxley had said 2 days before about, after all, it's not signifying to him whether he was descended from a gorilla or not, the bishop chaffed him and asked whether he had a preference for the descent being on the father's side or the mother's side, right? So the bishop's basically saying, Mr. Huxley, are you descended from an ape from your mother or your father's side? And Huxley says that he would sooner claim kindred with an ape than with a man like the bishop who made so ill a use of his wonderful speaking powers to try and burke, by a display of authority, a free discussion on what was or was not a matter of truth, and reminded him on that questions of physical science authority had always been bowled out by investigation, as witnessed astronomy and geology. Obviously, it was sensationalized in the papers a little bit more, but basically says, Huxley says, I'd rather be descended of an ape than be told by a clergyman what science is, right? So this is kind of one of the biggest moments in the evolution debate. And the second book, Descent of Man, Darwin says, yep, you guys are right. We claim evolution from the apes. Evolution is essentially assigned to fact. It's adopted faster than Copernicus, right? When Copernicus did the whole heliocentric model of the universe, it's kind of that paradigm shifting, but it's adopted faster. The idea that evolution, there of course it's attacked, furiously, like by the likes of Wilberforce, and particularly because there's no role for a creator or God in this. Even though Darwin was a very religious man and he kind of hated to see this, but he basically says, like, look, it's chaos out there. There's no order. Nature goes from a benign and stable, natural law kind of host. It goes from natural law to a world of struggle and competition in which the weak have no place, and change was eternally ongoing. Nothing is constant as change, right? That's the basic phrase that comes out of evolution. There's nothing as constant as change. But it's adopted rather quickly, mostly because of Huxley, and because it also fits in with some of the basic changes that are going on in the world, right? They're like, oh, well, I mean, pretty much our entire world is changing and being industrialized, so yeah, it makes sense that like this part of our worldview would be completely destroyed as well. And it's, of course, as we know, social Darwinism, the logical extending of Darwinism to society, rationalizes capitalistic economies. It rationalizes new racial ideas. It rationalizes nationalism. That Germany has succeeded and is now the most powerful on the continent of Europe because it was meant to be. Because we are the fittest. It's a circular logic, right? We dominate other peoples in the world because we have more stuff, we have better guns, and we develop better guns because we're just better. We're the fittest, we're the smartest, right? And therefore that we have the right to do this, to put other people across the world down. So the impact of Darwin cannot be underappreciated or underemphasized. Of course, here's Herbert Spencer. Social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, right? Thanks, buddy. Thanks for that. Okay, so moving on, because we could talk about Darwin for a long time. Gregor Mendel, right? Simple, you've seen this in biology, right? dominant alleles, recessive alleles. I think it's alleles, right? And then you breed them again. And he did this for like 40 years, from like the 1860s to, and he did this for a long time. And yeah, genetics, that's in itself the idea that we are in our own bodies controlled by something, and that our children, the outcomes of our children are controlled by something that we can't even see, that we can't even have control over. I mean, that is fundamentally unsettling. That you could possess something in your body that is either good, that predisposes your offspring to more survival, and the opposite, right? When Lindsay and I were starting to think of having children, we got genetic testing. Like, why wouldn't you, right? I mean, why wouldn't you go and just see, like, hey, like maybe I don't know it. Maybe I'm a carrier for I don't know. I have no idea. But this, we have Mendel to thank for that. Obviously, another clergyman. So, yeah. Okay, the next is we got to go with anthropology. Okay, and I wanted to bring up someone very interesting. This man named Paul Broca. Paul Broca was a good, quote unquote, good scientist for the most part. He actually came up with some interesting discoveries where he I think it's called the Broca's area of the brain, a region of the frontal lobe that's been named after him. This is the area that articulated knowledge, and he kind of figured out that people that had damage to that area couldn't speak right, or I'm not particularly but anyway, he was also a big fan of something called craniology, where, as you can see here in this diagram, the idea that he would take specimens, skulls, of white people, Europeans, and compare them with the skulls of Africans, and pretty much orchestrate his data to justify and rationalize racism. Basically saying, look, this brain, and he would pick, out of like 100 skulls, he would pick the biggest skulls of Europeans, whether or not those people had been intelligent in their lifetimes or not, and then pick the smallest of the specimens and say, look, all the African heads are smaller, and therefore they are not as smart, and the European heads are bigger, right? So this is an example of science not, of science being faked, of science being, of scientific method not being followed, and yet because of faith in science, people not fact-checking, people not reviewing the data, people not being able to corroborate, right, findings, that in an age where you're liable to believe anything. Remember that quote from part 1, you believe in nothing, so therefore you susceptible to believe everything. Craniology was used to justify racism and to justify imperialism. And this is kind of Paul Broca's good and bad. But anthropology, right, he's an anthropologist. The idea of exploring the worlds of races and tribes in areas where Europeans had new contact because of imperialism. The other idea is that because you're exploring so many new cultures, there's a new sense of relativism, right, of morals, of mores, and then there's that leads to skepticism as the universality of truth and experiences. So through this, people become more race conscious. People are able to argue that the white race is superior because of they're like, look at these tribes, look at these races, look how backwards they are, or how underdeveloped they are, right? That circular logic of that must prove that we are the fittest because we have more stuff, because we're more modern. Okay, so moving on to, and I think maybe I skipped one. Huh? Okay, so this is kind of anthropology, going back to anthropology. Um, this is Fraser's, Sir James George Fraser's The Golden Bough. This is based off of J.M.W. Turner painting from 1834. Remember, J.M.W. Turner is considered Romanticism, but he is like a big influence on the Impressionists. You can kind of see why, but if you want to get a better example, go to J.M.W. Turner's The Slave Ship, or the one where Parliament is burning. That's a good one. But the idea of Fraser's Golden Bough, basically, anthropology was used to show that there are these pretty much around the world, across the world, that in exploring these races and tribes, look, he basically says Christian practices have roots and similarities in other cultures, and there's certain things that just go with Christianity that, maybe, just maybe, Christianity is not as original as the powers that be have wanted you to believe, right? So there's a kind of another chink in the armor of Christianity being the the sole source of truth, and we know that that's gone away since the Enlightenment, but that's another element. Okay, so let's go back to Weber, Max Weber, and Emil Durkheim. Now, for whatever reason, Palmer just fails to mention these guys, and they're two of the most important social scientists of the late 19th century. And I'll just go quickly through this stuff. But essentially, Weber, right? Three basic things that you need to know about Weber, and we've already covered one. We've already covered the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, the idea that the Reformation led to Calvinism, and that the doctrine of predestination led to increasing numbers of people engaging in the secular world, building up enterprises, right? That all work, as long as it was in the name of strengthening God's community, was pious and worthy, right? We've gone through that. That Calvinism helped bring about capitalism, right? So that's one of his main ones. Then politics as a vocation, 1919. I don't know why that's misspelled. Let's just fix that. But essentially, you've heard us say this a couple of times before, that the state is the legitimate, claims the monopoly of legitimate use of physical force, right? The right to use violence. And then the rationalization thesis in 1920. And you can kind of read this quote, but a child of modern European civilization who studies problems of universal history shall inevitably and justifiably raise the question, what combination of circumstances have led to the fact that in the West, and here only, cultural phenomena have appeared which, at least as we like to think, came to have universal significance and validity, right? Basically that in the West, rationalism had been a powerful force, and everywhere else is still dominated by all this other stuff, and yes, so therefore the West is the best, right? So he gives kind of the one of the big first, big the rationalization thesis, like, kind of says it's okay, West, you are the best. So Emil Durkheim is incredibly important as well. He, as the modern father of sociology, right? He takes up where Comte and positivism leaves off. He asks this question of pretty much all his work: how can societies maintain their integrity and coherence in the modern era when things such as shared religious and ethnic background could no longer be assumed? And this is a fantastic quote, right? society lacks the unity based upon the commitment of men's wills to a common objective, then it is no more than a pile of sand that the least jolt or slightest puff will suffice to scatter. And you can read that whole thing in your own time. Major works. Suicide is the most interesting and important one. And he basically finds that more Protestants are killing themselves than Catholics at the end of the 19th century, 1897. And he basically concludes that human communities are fragile. They are shared sets of values and norms, not physical spaces. When those norms break down, like when a farmer has to move to the city, alienation from the community occurs. So he basically, picks up a little bit of where Marx leaves off, but without the politics, without the, revolution. Like, he's a social scientist. He's not arguing for a revolt against capitalism. He's saying no, this happens, and it creates a alienated part of the person. He calls this anomy, and in Catholicism there's a stronger social control and stronger group attachment, thus less alienation. And I don't know why this got cut off here. But we'll just put it here. He also comes up with the common consciousness, right? The totality of beliefs and sentiments common to the average members of a society forms a determinate system with a life of its own. It can be termed the collective or common consciousness. And Durkheim is the collective consciousness, and Carl Jung is going to be the collective unconscious, and we're going to go over him in a minute. Another guy that Palmer fails to mention. Okay, so we did this already. Okay, let's talk about Pavlov for a second. Obviously, you probably read about him when you were 4 years old, but the idea of conditioning dogs to behave unnaturally, demonstrating that some animal behavior is learned, not instinctive. This is, of course, true of humans as well, right? This would be true of humans. Some behavior is learned, not instinctive, and Freud picks up on this and obviously gives it a bit more nuance, and this is pretty much crude, but he's incredibly important in terms of ideas of, well, is it nature or is it nurture, right? Is it nature via nurture? Is it nature versus nurture, right? He basically says, no, there's stuff conditioned and there's stuff that you can condition outside of genetics, outside of biology. Hold on one second. I had to get my cat out of the room. Okay, Pavlov's not that interesting, but he is important. Let's go to Freud. Let's go to Mr. Sigmund Freud. The unconscious mind, repressed memories, conscious behavior and feelings, biological instincts driving the unconscious, right? Sexuality, of course, is one of the biggest ones. His influence is incredible, and this is a really good graphic of the ego, right? Here's the conscious mind, contact with the outside world. Here's the ego, the psychological component of the reality principle, secondary process thinking, reality testing. The ego, right? The more of the most in touch with the conscious mind, and then of course the id, the wish fulfillment, pleasure principle, primary purpose thinking, biological component, the instincts, and then the social component, the superego, moral imperatives, right? The stuff that is put on top by society, by religion, by all the outside components, conscience, and it's the iceberg idea is pretty powerful. having an unconscious drive to, as Nietzsche will say, to the will to power, or to competition to get more resources than the other guy, to have more sex than the other guy, to have more stuff, right? This is the idea of biological instincts driving the unconscious. That is the id. And you could argue, I think, that his fascination with dreams and his creating psychoanalysis is one of the most important things in the 19th century, because fundamentally he says that by including this part, right, he basically is saying that humans are not rational, right? That when they experience a trauma, especially, they will have that kind of boiling inside them at an unconscious level, and it will drive them to do things that they don't understand. It will drive them to do things that they don't understand and that they can't possibly, that you can't put enough social stuff on top of it in order to stop it, right? You can't put, this is what's holding down the iceberg, right? And if something is down here, some kind of repressed memory, some kind of feeling that is gonna drive behavior, it is not going to end well. So this is fundamentally that humans are not rational. That's his big contribution. So he was also, just so everybody knows, he was a, and obviously at the time, like, they didn't know the extent of the addictive nature of cocaine, but he was a horrible cocaine addict for pretty much for about 20 years, and you can read up on it in this New York Times article, and there's videos on it. There's a book written about it. But yeah, he was in a pretty bad way. He almost killed one of his patients. And after that, he stopped. But it really kind of, a lot of these people, and what another part that you have to understand about everything from romanticism to realism, throughout the 19th century, the idea of pushing limits, people were doing that with their own bodies and with things that they would ingest. And, this guy, Sigmund Freud, there it is, cocaine addict. But he did okay. He kicked the stuff after a while. Okay, so this is pretty much what I would say is Freud's, really sums up Freud's philosophy and his emphasis. And this is from a little bit later, Civilization and Its Discontents. And this is, I thought I would put John Singer Sargent's Gassed from 1919 in there. I think it's fantastic. Just it's right after World War One. So let's see. You can just read that. It's all right there. The idea that Freud propagates, that mankind is pretty much out of control, right? That mankind, the human self, is driven and stymied by natural forces beyond his or her complete control, and that sometimes your unconscious overwhelms you so that you do things that are pretty much out of your control, that you are kind of this close away from being out of control. That kind of sums up the First World War. I love this quote. The civilization has to use its utmost efforts in order to set limits to man's aggressive instincts and to hold the manifestations of him in check. I don't know why that's him, but him. By psychical reaction formations. Hence, therefore, the use of methods intended to incite people into identifications and aim inhibited relations of love, blah, blah, blah. A commandment, love. The idea of loving one neighbors as oneself, he says, is so counter to the original nature of man. That I think that pretty much sums up his contribution. But Palmer doesn't talk about Carl Jung. And now Carl Jung essentially was a student of Freud's for a while, but then started to think that Freud, and maybe it was the cocaine, I'm not sure, but started to think that Freud was pretty much too focused on sex and sexuality. As an unconscious driving force. He also thought that the unconscious was not entirely negative, right? Go back to that pessimism versus optimism thing. He was like, listen, the unconscious, there's, why do people cooperate in huge groups? There's altruism, it's not all doom and gloom. People can be creative. It's not just negative. He also broke with Freud on religion. Freud was absolutely anti-religion, as Ellie said. Basically, it's like religion. People want to be deceived, right? That's kind of like he was with Marx. Freud was like Marx in that religion was like the opiate of the masses. Carl Jung was like, religion is incredibly important. Carl Jung was the first to kind of pontificate that religion might be an evolved psychological mechanism, that religion served a purpose in allowing the person to find out who he or she really was, and that process is called individuation. Individuation, the process of knowing oneself, right? That religion, either rejecting the religion that you were brought up with and embracing a new one, or finding out for yourself which religion is right for you, or not believing in anything at all. Individuation is, he said, religion helps that. The safety of religion helps the process of discovering the self. Okay? And he also said that human beings are not just driven by sex, but individuation is itself an unconscious motivation. Individuation, the need to achieve the full knowledge of the self, will drive a person to do things to find out who they are. Longing for desire to feel complete, a longing for desire to know yourself will drive you to do things and take risks and push the envelope, as it were. I'm using that a lot. But he also had these kind of archetypes, the Jungian archetypes, and he also, as I said, came up with the idea of the collective unconscious, and we're gonna talk about that. But these two ideas are related, in that archetypes, he said, have existed throughout time since man was first evolved, and since then we have had a collective unconscious of those archetypes, right? So that unconsciously, what mask to wear when you're at home, when you're at school, right? The different social masks worn in different situations and in different groups, right? You wear a different mask when you're playing on the basketball team. You wear a different social mask when you're in AP Juro, right? I mean, these archetypes are ingrained in your brain and are unconsciously there. They're a form of protection. And then the anima, animus. The anima is feminine, animus is masculine, the opposite gender qualities and attributes of the psyche. So in women, they would have the animus. In men, they would have the anima, right? So the opposite gender qualities are present in every person. and a combination of that represents the true self, right? That no man is 100% manly and no woman is 100% womanly, right? That there's mixtures. And then another part is the shadow, an archetype, the dark side of the psyche, repressed memories. This is where he kind of corroborates or goes over with Freud, overlaps with Freud. And then the self, the unification of the conscious and unconscious, individuation, here's that word, individuation, and self-actuation, contains all aspects of an individual, right? But these parts of the unconscious are all mixed together with archetypes. And this is a great collective unconscious concept. The contents of the collective unconscious are archetypes, primordial images, meaning ancient images that reflect basic patterns that are common to us all and which have existed universally since the dawn of time. This is a very interesting idea. And I thought I would put this in, right? Jesus, 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 Superman. I thought that was incredibly funny, and not actually too far from what Jung is talking about, right? That there are archetypal events: birth, death, separation from parents, initiation, marriage, the union of opposites. These are that everybody can relate to. This is all part of the collective unconscious. That everybody has experienced this together. Archetypal figures: the great mother, father, child, devil, God, old wise man, old wise woman, the trickster, the hero. Right? This shows up in mythology again and again and again. It shows up in religion again and again and again. Archetypal motifs: the apocalypse, the deluge, right? Which is the flood, right? Noah's Ark, the creation. Yeah, pretty much across the board. Every culture, every religion, right? All have these motifs. And then the recurring archetypal images: the shadow, and these are kind of going back to the last slide. The wise man, the child, and their counterpart. The emergence of certain definite archetypes: the shadow, the animal. So all of this stuff, the collective unconscious is a group of shared images and archetypes. And he posited that when you dream, you're not totally dreaming as yourself. That the unconscious is expressions of not just your unconscious, but of the collective unconscious. That your dreams, if you think about your dreams, they're like these are symbolic of something larger, something bigger, something bigger going on in the world. So it's a really, really powerful concept, and Jung is incredibly influential. I mean, like his basic idea that he would do this activity where he would make you write down everything that you didn't like about other people, and then you would realize that it was all the things that you didn't like about yourself, right? I mean, it was like, I gotta find the exact quote here. Hold on. The exact quote is fantastic. Let's see. Carl Jung. I just had it. I apologize. Here we go. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Right? So I hate it when other people are so impatient. Hey, maybe I'm impatient sometimes. Right? Okay. And it wasn't that far from Freud in that. Okay, but we got to move on. Okay, so next up, physics. Pierre and Marie Curie. Essentially, radiation. Right? Radioactivity, the very idea that there are certain elements that like have energy, right? This will lead into Einstein's idea that mass can be energy, right? E equals mc squared. So Niels Bohr, the electron, right? Coming with the idea that updating that idea from antiquity, that atoms things are not solid. Things are continually moving. Changing the idea that the atom from a solid piece of matter to complex changeable elements that released energy, right? So Niels Bohr is very important for the idea of the electrons rotating around a nucleus, and then of course Albert Einstein and Werner Heisenberg. But of course, Einstein's theory of relativity is essential. I mean, it's like the very idea that it's not you that's moving, it's space, right? That time, space, and motion are not absolute, but relative to the position of the observer, right? I mean, he totally destabilizes the view that man is the master of his universe, right? In 1905, it's the theory of relativity. It totally upsets Newtonian certainties. Totally upsets by arguing that mass could be converted into energy. Obviously, this leads into the atomic bomb later on in the 20th century, but the more immediate implication is that if the speed of light is constant, then at extreme speeds, time and space warp. They don't behave in the unchanging fashion of the Newtonian universe. So he's just completely throwing Newton out the door, kind of like Copernicus threw the church out the door, and how Darwin did the same in evolution. I mean, 1905. The theory of relativity, that is incredibly important. That is relativity. That is relativism, right? That we can't really know where we are at any given time. That we can't really know, just like the Heisenberg comes up with the uncertainty principle, that we can't really know where an electron is at any given time. That it's just that you can't even measure things anymore. Just when society thought that it was going to start becoming, that it was using science to measure everything, and in the 19th century that governments started to take censuses, and they were measuring everything. They were measuring the people. They were measuring, they were improving ways to make battleships and all sorts of stuff. The very idea that you can't measure something, the very act of measurement. And that the very act of measurement changes the thing that's being measured. I mean, that's just how do you cope with that? Now we get to Nietzsche. Nietzsche, okay, incredibly influential and highly controversial. Not a feminist, not at all. I mean, in weird ways he was, but in other ways he wasn't. And he could have had syphilis. That's one of the reasons why they think he might have gone insane. He also had a terrible opium addiction, as many of these people did in the 19th century. But his writings are various, right? We talked about the idea of nihilism, the unbelief, but really nihilism, as he puts it, is kind of the idea that there were values, and this is a very modernist. I mean, he typifies modernism, that there were values, and now those are gone. Right? God is dead, and we have killed him, and that's a good thing, because now we can move on to a new set of values that we have to find meaning and morals without anybody's guiding hand. And he really truly believes that this is a good thing, that by rejecting Christian values, rejecting the slave morality, you can create your own ethics, and that humankind can create their own ethics through the Superman with his courage, his beauty, his intellectual strength, and the will to power, and his dominating society. Obviously, you can see why Hitler thought that that the Nazis drew from some of this stuff. But he basically says, that he's along the lines of reason, those ideas of pure reason. He basically says that Kant is fluff, that you can't have pure reason, and he's totally anti-enlightenment, placing the irrational over the rational, and these are some of his These are some of his best quotes, I think. To accept a faith just because it is customary, but that means to be dishonest, to be cowardly, to be lazy, and to do dishonesty, cowardice, and laziness then appear as the presupposition of morality. This is a good one. Surest way to corrupt a youth is to instruct him to hold a higher esteem those who think alike than those who think differently. Morality is herd instinct of the individual, right? And this is the Superman, the Overman. That's probably a better translation of it. Madness is rare in individuals, but in groups, parties, nations, and ages it is the rule. Which is it? Is man one of God's blunders, or is God one of man? The very word Christianity is misunderstanding. Truth, there is only one Christian, and he died on the cross. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, he's incredibly hard to understand sometimes, but essentially, I think the idea that the abandoning of values from the Enlightenment is a good thing in his book, and essentially, yeah, I mean, he's most influential in that he doesn't have the staying power because he goes crazy, and people are always trying to figure out what he meant, right? Okay, and he's easily taken kind of both ways. You can see how the Nazis took him. Okay, we have to look at this is by the way, this is when we get to Nietzsche and when we're doing this stuff after the physics stuff, we're trying to answer the question, how did philosophy and the arts respond to the new science and the new values? So we just did Nietzsche. We've already talked about realism a little bit and social criticisms, right? I mean, particularly Emile Zola and the Dreyfus Affair, right? The J'accuse, and people starting to speak out on social problems. The symbolist poets. These are two symbolist poets that we need to mention: Charles Baudelaire and Arthur Rimbaud. Now, these guys essentially they celebrate the grand, illogical, intuitive. They're post-romantic, post-realist, but they are kind of not. Well, I guess you can call them realists, but they kind of typify modernism in that they are rejecting pretty much any kind of rational, reasoned writing. They're all about dreams. They're all about visions. They're all about the supernatural. So, I mean, they're carrying on the legacy of Romanticism. They're all about the derangement of the senses, and using things like Baudelaire, his great work is The Flowers of Evil, but using things like the flower to illustrate larger truths, right? They're rejecting reason. They're rejecting any kind of, they're basically living for the moment. I mean, this guy, Baudelaire, was a horrible opium addict, and Rimbaud died when he was 37. But this is typical. I'm working at turning myself into a seer. You won't understand any of this, and I'm almost incapable of explaining it to you. The idea is to reach the unknown by the derangement of all the senses. It involves enormous suffering, but one must be strong to be a born poet. It's really not my fault. And then this guy, Charles Baudelaire: if rape or arson, poison or the knife has wove no pleasing patterns in the stuff of this drab canvas we accept as life, it is because we are not bold enough. I mean, that's kind of capturing the idea of an unconscious, right? That that the dark, the shadow, what Jung calls, right? These are the shadow things that Baudelaire is twisting into pleasurable things. but they were seen as obscene at the time. They were seen as incredibly just gross, and they still had lots and lots of impact. Okay, let's move on. We're almost done. Let's get some color in here. Okay, Impressionism. We're gonna go into this more in depth, but essentially, we're asking the question: how did philosophy and the arts respond to the new social science, the new science, all this new science stuff and its new values? Well, the artist is becoming more distant from society, both artistically in what they sought to represent, and how they viewed themselves. I mean, they weren't any longer necessarily, caring about being commissioned by, the prince of or the king of whatever, right? They are painting for themselves, and they are painting to capture a moment, especially in Impressionism. These are moments of light and shade. They are representing themselves and not society. Okay, they're not necessarily trying to make a big they're taking themselves out of society. Essentially, they're carrying on the romantic tradition of rejecting society for the most part, even though a lot of Impressionists drew industrial settings. Not here, but these are Monet's. But they did reject some, like the Romantics did. Like they did reject society kind of physically. Like Van Gogh abandoned Paris for they went into the small towns. They painted outdoors. They rejected academic styles. They're looking for whatever kind of tickles their fancy, I guess, if you can kind of say that. They're really out for themselves. They're not trying to please anybody else. They're trying to please themselves. So we can talk more in depth about Impressionism, 1865 to 1885. Post-Impressionism, kind of the next wave. Van Gogh is considered post-impressionist, and Paul Gauguin, La Orana Maria, kind of the Hail Mary. This is like kind of shows the anthropological fascination of the post-impressionists. They become more abstract and novel in their use of colors and shapes. Not necessarily looking to represent reality, but their inner thoughts. He's saying like, why can't the Virgin Mary? This is a very romantic idea. I think we looked at a painting that by Delacroix, about Native American Indians that were kind of a nativity scene. But look in the background here. It looks like almost a bird. This is very different than liberty leading the people. If you think about Delacroix, right, or the realism of Courbet, and some of the realism from chapter 14 that I included in there. This would be the next kind of wave, Matisse and Fauvism, also known as the wild beasts, le Fauve. It was what one art critic called this style. But notice how it still has these lines, right? These perspective lines that everything's disappearing to an infinity point. You know what I mean? There's still some kind of geometry here. In Expressionism, that's gone, right? This abstract. This is Kandinsky, Vasily Kandinsky. This is later. This is 1923. This is 1905. Matisse. But they're just kind of trying to expose you guys to this is earlier. This is a kind of a shorter period. This is a longer overall period. But this is all technically part of modernism. And then you have the Cubists, and this is Picasso. This is the most famous one. The idea of taking something like five women and just I don't really know what's going on here, right? I mean, like there's no perspective, there's no depth. Everything's coming out at different angles, and that's the key here. Is that the idea of the Renaissance perspective, like that those disappearing lines where you have some kind of leg to stand on when you're looking at it. It's unsettling. It's just completely unsettling because you don't know who's in the foreground, who's in the background. Like there's no depth. And the same thing here. This is George Braque. This is woman reading. I mean, this is absolutely amazing. I mean, maybe there's a mouth up here, maybe there's eyes, maybe there's a face here. I mean, it's incredibly, off-putting but beautiful at the same time. And this actually just came out in Time magazine this week. I thought this was amazingly well-timed. This is a portrait of trees and a descending path, but you see there's no vantage point, there's no perspective. And he said in 1908, "The whole Renaissance tradition is repugnant to me. The hard and fast rules of perspective which it has succeeded on imposing in art were a ghastly mistake which has taken 4 centuries to redress." And it was Braque and Picasso that they were responsible for this. So the Cubists we will definitely return to, but you can kind of see that, everything is unmoored. It's even perspective in art. Everything is totally being taken out. The stuffing is being taken out. It's being examined and it's being thrown away. And some parts remain, but largely not. I mean, like between the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution, you have 100 years of incredible change. And at the turn of the century, people just don't know which way is up anymore. People don't know literally. I mean, you could probably turn this painting on its head and be just as, what am I looking at? Especially the one before, right? You could turn this around and be like, what am I looking at? Okay, women reading. So, last couple points. Organized religion. How did organized religion respond? We've already talked about how Durkheim showed how Protestantism was Protestants were killing themselves way more than Catholics. Obviously, Christianity is threatened. The techniques of modern scholarship are applied to the Bible. I mean, you have Nietzsche saying God is dead and we have killed him, and that's a good thing because now we can move on from Christian values and find values that are good for everybody, essentially. The Protestant churches are becoming more casual, serving less of a role. They're divided between the modernists who accept science and interpret the Bible spiritually, and the fundamentalists, obviously very strong in the United States, especially still, and the Catholic Church, right? This is from the 17th century, so don't worry about this piece of art. But you can kind of tell if we go from this back to Braque, okay, it's a little bit different. But a couple things. The Pope we know in 1864 declares the syllabus of errors. Basically coming down hard on liberalism in general. Also, they call the first church council in 300 years to confirm the dogma of papal infallibility. The Catholics are hostile to republicanism, liberalism, even nationalism, right? Think about Italian unification and how the Pope kind of concealed himself in Vatican City. They also declare, Pope Pius X declares ad diem illum, which essentially reaffirms the Virgin Mary as immaculate and the Immaculate Conception, and this drives women back into the church like by the thousands. They say yes, like we've been waiting for this to happen. Also, Pope Leo XIII, the Rerum Novarum, which basically is the idea where he basically issues something where he says, we believe in private property, but we are criticizing capitalism for the poverty and misery that it's causing. So essentially, it's a Christian kind of non-materialistic socialism, and it strengthens Catholic resolve in labor parties and socialist parties and labor unions, which is incredibly interesting. And they use propaganda and modern forms of advertising, pamphlets, and placards and flyers. And I just had to, remember Pope Leo X. We weren't on Pope Leo XVI, but Leo X was the one the Medici Pope, who essentially allowed the Reformation to get a foothold. And of course, we would be remiss if we didn't mention, this is Moses Mendelssohn. He comes up with the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment. He's one of the main thinkers in the Jewish Enlightenment, Reform Judaism, right? That you don't have to necessarily follow the Orthodox tradition. Then, of course, there are the Russian pogroms, the incredible anti-Semitism, especially in Russia. We've already covered the Dreyfus Affair. I wanted to point out the Richard Wagner in 1869, right? He did Die Ring der Nebeln, which is like essentially what Hitler uses as propaganda music. Right? That's he uses that. He wrote this Das Judentum in der Musik, which basically Jewishness in music. An incredibly anti-Semitic piece, and it's sad because Wagner in the 1848 revolutions he wrote Die Ring des Nebeln about essentially capitalism and the failed revolutions of 1848 and how that was a failed opportunity by socialism to enact some kind of major change to the power structure in Europe. And then he writes this horrible treatise to explain to ourselves the involuntary repugnance possessed by, not even worth reading. So that plays into the fascists in Germany rather nicely for them. And then, of course, Theodor Herzl, ideas of Judaic nationalism, right? That he calls for a Jewish state in Palestine. Right, that starts in the late 19th century, and of course there's debates over what's primacy, the Jewish faith or their quote unquote nationality, right? And that's one of the main gripes that Europeans have, that they throughout the 19th century, and you even see this in the French Revolution, that Jewish populations are emancipated to a certain extent, they're assimilated to a certain extent, they're freed of legal restrictions, they enter professions and businesses that they couldn't enter before, they become more urbanized, yet they are constantly suppressed in other ways. They are, once social Darwinism comes out, they're the brunt of racialist theories. They become the butt of critiques of capitalism, people saying, oh, it's the Jewish bankers' fault, and of course they are always labeled as, well, who are you loyal to? Are you loyal to your Jewish heritage, or are you loyal to the nation, right? Whatever nation, and that, the Dreyfus Affair is a particular example of that. Okay, so let's go back to where this started. Remember where we started in chapter 15, where I did that overview of liberalism, right? Where classical liberalism as articulated by Locke, John Stuart Mill, put in play by William Gladstone, believed at its heart in the liberty of the individual, of independent of any rational, believed in the liberty of the individual, independent of any collective identity like race or nationality, right? Using reason to find solutions with like-minded others in some form of representative government. I'll say that again, right? Classical liberalism, Locke, John Stuart Mill, Gladstone, believed at its heart in the liberty of the individual independent of any collective identity like race or nationality, and using their God-given reason to find solutions with like-minded others in some form of representative government. Right? Religion being a matter of personal preference, laissez-faire economics, the separation of politics and business is the best way of maintaining liberty and ensuring prosperity, right? This belief had been held throughout the early 19th century, but had been challenged throughout the latter half of the 19th century. We have to remember that. This myth of the rational is challenged. Remember that the 20-year depression, the long depression beginning in 1873, helps this along, right? That the protectionist tariffs go up, the abandonment of free trade, industrialization has spread way beyond Britain, creating more manufacturing centers. Their countries are competing for natural resources and raw materials in Asia and Africa, and laissez-faire is giving way to a kind of neo-mercantilism or economic nationalism. There's bigger corporations, right? There's that are vertically and horizontally integrated. So there's the new liberalism, the welfare state, essentially, the Labor Party, and this facilitates a process of people voting the party line, right? A kind of partisan politics starts. Also, you have to remember that the United States is emerging at this time, so there's increased competition from not just when Germany unifies, but also the United States after the Civil War. So liberalism, fundamentally, all these between the Long Depression and between all the ideas of Darwin, of Freud, of Nietzsche, of Jung, Durkheim, liberalism, based on the premise of the rationality of man, has been totally shaken. Right? There's a anti-rationality component. There's an anti-intellectualism component. Right? That the Superman, the Übermensch, as it is in German, the Übermensch. The Übermensch doesn't need reason, right? And I included this quote from George Sorel, the syndicalist. Violence can save the world from barbarism. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. So essentially, what we want to take away from this is that rationality, reason is no longer suffices. Ideas have lost their neutrality. Ideas are basically now connected to class, to race, to ethnicity, to the unconscious. Ideas of political compromise based on mutual discussion are lost. Emotion, irrationalism is predominating over reason, violence over compromise, even though this is a very peaceful time. So why in this time of a long period of peace and growing prosperity, our ideas of struggle, of violence, and emotion developed, and why is this also the most brutal time period in terms of economic imperialism, of national jockeying for position around the world, an arms race. There's an incredible arms race in this time period. So the basic question that we need to ask ourselves as we work towards World War One is, why does the onset of World War One come with such celebration and fanfare, right? Why did some hate this new godless, themeless, sordid view of life as the animalistic struggle for raw power and existence, while others seem to revel in it? I mean, this time period, these ideas of modernism are incredibly challenging, and have fascinated people and historians alike for a long, long time. So we're not going to get to the bottom of this anytime soon, but we will try. Okay.